Another key distinction between people seems to be in terms of their optimism level versus their pessimism level. So if we look at optimism and pessimism, it does seem to tie in a lot to our locus of control. It is a decent way of how to assess how helpless versus how effective you feel in a given situation. There have been correlational studies done where they find that having a higher level of optimism does tend to be linked with higher health. If you want to take a moment and assess how optimistic versus how pessimistic you are, if you Google optimism test, you should be able to find one published by Psychology Today. I'll link it on your homework page, but this will allow you to figure out how optimistic versus pessimistic you are. So maybe some of this stuff will be a little bit easier to relate to. But when we look at optimism, usually we would like to think that, seeing the glass as half full is a good thing. And in a lot of ways it is. But if we're too optimistic, if you're overly optimistic, there can also be some negative consequences. Sometimes you can be blind to possible risks in a situation. We seem to see this happening, especially in adolescent populations, of which you are a part of. You have this false sense of invincibility. And sometimes that plays out in really troubling ways. You see a lot of teenagers, especially getting into car accidents, maybe based on texting and driving or not wearing a seatbelt. And the reason why we see such bad outcomes, especially for teenage driving with these poor decisions, is based on this idea of invincibility. This idea that, well, it's not going to happen to me. Someone else might get in a car crash because they were texting and driving, but I'm really good at it. And so this can be a way that you're being excessively optimistic, thinking that nothing bad's going to happen to you. Another example of this would be with a college-age population. Every kid thinks that they won't have any sort of alcohol problems when they get to college. They think, even if they're binge drinking is a really, really big problem on college campuses. They think, well, I hear all the time that binge drinking can lead to alcoholism, that there's all of these negative consequences of binge drinking, but that's for someone else. I can handle it myself, I have it under control. These other people have these problems, but it would never happen to me. And so this is a way that we're being blind to very real risks because we think that we are invincible. Another blindness we can experience based on excessive optimism, here it has to do with optimism about our own abilities. Oftentimes we're blind to our own possible incompetence. We find that if you really want to judge how well you can do something, you need to be good at the task to begin with, because our own judgment of how good or how poorly we perform on something is based on our own experience with that. And you only know what you know. So if you really don't know everything that's on a test, for example, you only have maybe a 65% grasp on the material and you take the test, oftentimes you might come away thinking you did better than you did because you're focusing on the stuff that you knew. They find time and time again when they look at studies that a lot of people who do poorly on tasks, for example, kids or students who scored in the bottom percentage on a grammar task or a logic task, actually believed they had scored in the top half of the entire class. So they're overly optimistic about their abilities. They're unable to judge themselves fairly or accurately. And this is based on their own lack of competence. If they were competent in the task, they would be better suited to judge how well they did. For example, if you wanted someone else to judge how well you're doing on something, you sort of want them to be an expert in that field. You wouldn't want someone who is maybe skilled in teaching art, for example, to be grading your psychology tests. That wouldn't necessarily be fair because whilst their expertise might lie in the art field, that certainly doesn't mean that they would be equipped to judge your psychology knowledge. So if you don't know something really well, if you're incompetent, it makes it more difficult for you to judge your own abilities. And so that's why it's really important to not only judge yourself, but to also have peers evaluate you and other people evaluate you, because that's the only way you can get a good sense of how skilled you are in a certain area. So sort of long story short, yes, an optimistic worldview is linked with higher levels of happiness, but there are a couple of possible pitfalls. So once you're aware of them, hopefully you won't encounter them.